All right. We're sitting here on a beautiful overlook in Windsor, Connecticut. Is that where we are? Yeah.
Probably closer to Bloomfield, but...
Okay. This is definitely the coolest place I've ever recorded a podcast. We felt like talking about John Muir, we should definitely be out in nature. And so, yeah, we found this nice overlook. We just saw a turkey vulture pass overhead. And, had a nice little hike this morning. Now we're here to talk about John Muir. So we met actually around this time last year.
Yes.
On the Appalachian Trail,
Mm-hmm.
which was really cool. Kind of a funny night. We met somebody whose trail name was Smokey Bear.
Smokey Bear.
And they called him Smokey Bear because he smoked like a chimney and snored like a bear.
And he lived up to his name that night. So
yeah, I don't think even my dad snores as much as loud as this guy. It was insane. We all were in the same shelter with this guy. Bit of a trail legend on the trail apparently.
Yeah, and he was louder than the storm that night too. It was a big
right,
storm.
It was storming. That's why we were all in the shelter in the first place.
But
yeah, and then the next day, you and I hiked together for a little bit, and we were just kind of chatting. And we got into what I thought was a great conversation. I was actually reading John Muir at the time because I was planning on hiking the John Muir Trail, and all of the fires kind of made that out of the question. So I last minute switched and did a section of the Appalachian Trail. I kind of had some of these ideas in my head, and we were kind of got into talking about nature and God and spirituality and whatnot. And you were telling me that you were actually writing a book about your kind of spiritual journey and your experiences in nature and how that has related to your faith and whatnot.
I just, ever since I've restarted hiking, because I used to hike when I was younger, but then as I got older, I just took it up again, and I just found that being out here is almost like a metaphor for life. For at least for your spiritual life, because it has ups and downs and lows, the valleys and the mountaintops.
Literally, yeah.
But what I found was, what I really liked most, I think, about it is that it's not the goals. I think a lot of hikers kind of focus so much on goals that they forget that it's the journey itself that's exciting. Yeah. The sights, the sounds, the smells, the struggles, all of that kind of contributes to the joy that you get in the hike. And so I just started reflecting more and more as I went on each hike to just sort of consider how is this speaking to me about my life, about my spiritual life, about just life in general. And I just found that, and I think that's why we connected so well, just because we're both sort of on that same page of just seeing hiking as just sort of a way to help us appreciate the journey of life.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and that's something that hiking's taught me that as well. Well, I was thinking maybe we could back up a little bit and just do like a little quick summary of John Muir's life, just to give everybody kind of a background of, who this guy was, because he's one of these characters who it's hard to kind of talk about his writing without knowing a little bit about his life, because, this piece is comprised of a lot of letters and journal entries where he is talking about these events that are very specific to his life. So it's kind of hard to just talk about the ideas in the abstract. All right, so he, it's kind of funny. He's like kind of Mr. America guy, but he actually was born in Scotland in 1838. But he immigrated to Wisconsin when he was 11 and was raised Calvinist by in pretty strict father from what I could tell. He was only allowed to read secular literature in the wee hours of the morning. Then he went to the University of Wisconsin for 2 years studying botany, and had a summer botanical excursion, and that kind of whetted his appetite for adventure. And he dropped out of college and was working at a wagon wheel factory, and had an experience where I think something from the wagon shot off and hit him in the eye and nearly blinded him, and he was he couldn't see for close to a month or something. And that was kind of his as he puts it, kind of his like wake up call from God, telling him like, hey, you kind of have this yearning to get out into nature, go on this adventure. And like the way he puts it, God has to nearly kill us sometimes to teach us lessons. So the next kind of phase of his life after this near blindness incident is kind of his adventurous years. So he kicks it off with this 1,000-mile walk from Kentucky to Florida. And again, this was like in 1867. So there was no trails. Like he's just bushwhacking through the woods. So it was, super, super dangerous. And yeah, he hiked to Florida. He actually got pneumonia on this trip, almost died. Was like passed out in the woods for several days, and some people picked him up, like put him back to health. Then he went to Cuba. Then he sailed to San Francisco, became a sheep herder, and then walked to Yosemite, worked in a sawmill, and spent his summers just up in the Yosemite Mountains, just taking in nature, writing about the plants and the wildlife and whatnot. And Ralph Waldo Emerson also kind of visited him during this period. So this is kind of this period of his life that I think he's probably most known for. This is the kind of wild man that he is depicted as, where he was just, the truly, living in the wilderness.
Mm-hmm. But it's kind of funny you say wild man, but you read what he writes about it, and there's such a gentleness about it that I just find comforting, because it just, I don't know, it just says something about what the roughness does to you. It sort of reminds me of like water over stones. The water just keeps rushing over stones, and then what do you get? You get smooth stones, and I think like the roughness that he went through just made him a more and more gentle individual.
Well, and on the point about his kind of gentleness, he talks about when he went to Cuba on this ship. He went from Florida to Cuba on this ship, and there was a storm. And so like all of the people on the ship were huddled underneath, and he was like, he had to like convince the captain to just let him up on the deck, because he just wanted to be in this storm and basically like tie himself to the mast and just experience it. And there's another famous essay. It actually wasn't in this collection, but it's I think it's called a windstorm in the forest. Yeah, a windstorm in the forest, where he says, quote, "When the storm began to sound, I lost no time in pushing out into the woods to enjoy it. After cautiously casting about, I made a choice of the tallest of a group of Douglas spruces. I experienced no difficulty in reaching the top of this one, and never before did I enjoy so noble an exhilaration of motion." And I don't know about you, but I've hiked in some storms and some lightning, and when the weather starts to turn, the last thing I'm doing is like looking for the tallest tree to climb.
Oh yeah.
So he definitely has some thrill-seeking, but my, at least reading of this, was it didn't seem like it was just thrill-seeking for like thrill-seeking sake. It still seemed like these kind of experiences were him trying to get close to God, or whatever you want to call it.
First thing I thought about was like Lieutenant Dan and
Forrest Gump.
Up on the mast and just kind of having it out with God. And I know it's sort of a different kind of circumstance, but it's just, I think it's almost like he's just like, I know you could like take me out, so whatever, like I'm going to surrender to that. Yeah. And I think about my own life. I'm not too willing to surrender, to whatever, God wants to do in my life. I go kicking and screaming a lot of times. I think a lot of us do. We want our comfortable life. That's why I like the woods, because the woods, they take me out of that comfort zone, and like you have to experience it. I mean, when a storm comes by, I'm always kind of thinking, okay, when the hair bristles on the back of my neck, I got to get down in the crouch position and, get away from the tall trees. And, I'm glad I'm in the shelter when it's storming and all of that. And so I don't know if I would, like you said, climb a tree and say, have at me, Lord, or whatever. But I think it's it's still okay to kind of feel that vulnerability and to
Yeah.
enjoy it, to enjoy being kind of in that vulnerable place and knowing that, maybe you won't come through, but trusting that you're going to come through it. So
That's definitely something I'm going to try to reflect on in my next lightning storm when I'm in the mountains, because I actually camped out last year when I was hiking part of the AT. Yeah, I was camped out on top of this mountain, and I was the highest thing for like 2 miles. The storm wasn't supposed to hit till like the next day in the afternoon, and was just full. I was just full on lightning storm, and yeah, I'm just in like the lightning crouch position on my little mat, but it's also just like, like you said, very vulnerable. Like there's nothing I can, other than just kind of crouching here on my little sleep pad. Like I'm super vulnerable.
yeah. And I have family members and friends who think I'm crazy for going out by myself, and they'll call me on the trail and say, "We just wanted to check and make sure you're okay." And I wish you just go out with other people, and I don't like when you go out on your own, and like I think what you said earlier, it's the idea that I could die in my bed tonight. Something could happen. I could die driving home from this hike. Anything could happen.
It is pretty incredible to, because I'll tell people when I come back from backpacking, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you do that." And recently, the people that said that to me were some of these other. I sell comedy tickets in Times Square, so some of the other sellers in Times Square were telling me, "Oh, I could never go out in the mountains," and I was just thinking, like, how much more dangerous it probably is selling comedy tickets in Times Square, and like, when you're actually looking at like statistics, your statistics of dying are probably much higher.
Oh yeah.
In New York City. But Muir, actually, this was just a minor point he made, but he has an idea that basically, like, the things that scare us because they are foreign to us. He says, quote, "I think that most of the antipathies which haunt and terrify us are morbid productions of ignorance and weakness. I have better thoughts of those alligators now that I have seen them at home." So he's speaking specifically about when he had all these fears around alligators, and then when he actually went and saw the alligators out in the wild, like, then he was no longer afraid of them. I can definitely relate to that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I think about so many, the first time I went, re-went hiking, because like I said, I'd been hiking before when I was younger, but when I went again, I went on the Appalachian Trail totally unprepared. I had like a school backpack. I had stuff bungeed to it. People were very kind and didn't make fun of me, and I ended up starting very late. I got out, I was working a night shift and got out late, and my wife insisted that I sleep, and I kept saying I need to get there as early as I can because I have 10 miles to go to get to the shelter. And so anyway, it was like 8:30 at night, and I got stuck in the middle of the woods and had to just set up in the middle of the trail. And this is like my first new experience of hiking, and it really was just terrified to be out there. I don't know why.
Yeah.
It was probably because it was foreign, because I wasn't used to it. Every little twig snap was a bear. It was probably a mouse.
Yeah.
But the whole night I hardly got any sleep because it was so foreign. Now people say, "How can you go out there and sleep in the woods?" And it's just like, because I'm comfortable.
Yeah.
It's just, I've gotten so used to it. And I mean, I'm aware of things, but I don't know. I don't worry as much anymore. It's just because I've gotten comfortable, kind of, I don't know, maybe if it's more of a oneness with nature or whatever, but it's just I'm more comfortable.
Well, yeah, and it's that idea that things generally are never going to be as scary as they are in our own imagination. And I was thinking this can even relate to something like death. Death is the ultimate unknown, and the fear that surrounds death. And even, this is maybe a little bit of a stretch, but I think a lot of times there's a kind of fear around different kinds of people who we've never had experience with, where it's just like, I don't know, maybe somebody is afraid of black people or afraid of gay people, and they've never met a black person or a gay person. There's that kind of, the ignorance of never having contact with the individual causes a fear of it. So yeah, I think it's a big idea. So maybe we can continue on. So he comes back to live in Oakland for like 10 months, and then he goes back to Yosemite, and this time it's not the same for him. So this was from the book. They said something had changed. His effortless spiritual rapport with the Yosemite landscape eluded him. Dimmed by the long immersion in city life, no one of the rocks seemed to call me now, nor any of the distant mountains. Throughout these letters, he talks about this like being called to the mountains, and that's his most famous quote. That's the first quote I ever heard was, "The mountains are calling, and I must come." And that kind of call went away when he tried to come back. It just, things weren't the same.
Yeah, and I kind of wonder if was it maybe what he was bringing with him, sort of was that maybe masking the call? Because I think about when I haven't been hiking for a while, and I've been I get so caught up in life and in my comfort zone, feeding my appetites and just sort of living, a little less like the man I want to be. And then when I get back out here, sometimes it takes a while to kind of get back into the zone or whatever you want to call it. But I think it's more like I need to take that whatever civilization is stuck on me and sort of shed it, sort of like get rid of it, the kind of fat, lazy comfortableness of being, where things are easy.
The kind of domesticated aspect of your comforts, your conveniences. I feel the same thing for sure. It's those transitions that are difficult. It's the transition into, going into the woods. It's the transition of coming back. I know for me, because last year I did 5 weeks on the Appalachian Trail, and when I came back, I was kind of that like post-trail. I don't know if depression's too strong of a word, but
no,
I was a little bummed, and I just like didn't want to be inside, and I was kind of forced to be inside because I was working. But it's just after being outside, almost 24 hours a day, you just like the roof just is repellent.
Oh yeah, that makes total sense, and I find a lot of people can't understand that. It's sort of like they're kind of more like, why do you want to do this? How could you not want the comforts?
And it's interesting because he says that too. He says something along the lines, he says, quote, "It seems strange that everybody does not come at their call," meaning the mountain's call. And I was wondering, do you think that's like a temperament thing? Like there are certain temperaments that are more drawn to, to be in nature? Or do you think it has more to do with, like we said earlier, like if you've spent a good deal of time in the past out in nature, you're going to be more drawn to do it?
I thought maybe it has to do a little bit with introversion and extroversion, because here you're alone. You face your own loneliness. So I think you have to kind of have a comfortableness with that. I'm an extreme introvert, so I can be out here and deal with that. And I also think people have different kinds of callings. Yeah. I think writers have a calling, musicians have a calling, teachers have a calling, and so there's certain places where people feel really comfortable based on their calling. So I don't know. I don't know if it's a temperament thing or...
That's an interesting angle. I had not thought about the kind of one's comfort in being alone with themselves as that being a factor.
Oh, and it's scary how comfortable I can be being by myself. And the thing is, in the woods, it's sort of exponentially more intense.
Yeah.
I always talk to people about, I call it the confessional of the woods. How Catholics will go into confession, they'll go into the scary black box and just bare their soul to their confessor and receive absolution, and like you have to bare your soul. And being in the woods, you're totally vulnerable. You can't hide from yourself. You can't make excuses for your failures and things. It's all laid bare there. And so in a sense, I find that I have to become very open to my flaws and failures and just sort of lay them bare before God and accept sort of the absolution that comes, the assurance that it's okay.
Yeah.
Like that he lets me know it's okay. It's okay that you fail. You know, it's a forgivable offense. And there's, you know, there's a lot of joy. It's very cleansing to go through that. And just like I said, just the sense of just, you know, I have nowhere else to go. You know, I cannot lie my way out of in my own head. You know, I can't pretend and make excuses for what I'm going through. I know what my flaws are, and they become very apparent in this weakened condition in the woods where I'm struggling to get up the next hill and everything. So
I love thinking about it as a confession. I actually watched this show called Alone. It was one of these kind of survival shows. It's basically actual Survivor, where these people are just dropped in the middle of complete wilderness and have to just survive by themselves. And for a lot of them, the biggest struggle is not, you know, finding water or getting food. It's being alone with themselves. And on the first season, there's this very dramatic episode where the guy basically has this confession, and you know, they have the camera there, and he's just talking about, oh, these are my weaknesses, and you're seeing him just like breaking down, crying, and like this kind of purging, this kind of confession. When it's interesting hearing Muir talk about solitude too, because this was kind of something that he battled. In one letter, he says, quote, "Were it not for a thought now and then of loneliness and isolation, the pleasure of my existence would be complete." But then in some of these other letters, he says, quote, "I felt not a trace of loneliness while he was gone." This is talking about his friend. He says, "On the contrary, I never enjoyed grander company. The whole wilderness seems to be alive and familiar, full of humanity. The very stones seem talkative, sympathetic, brotherly." So yeah, it's interesting hearing that kind of juxtaposition where sometimes just being with nature was enough to keep him company, and other times he did kind of want that companionship. It sounds like. I would love to touch on the you know, a lot of these pieces are about Muir's Muir's spiritual writings, and Muir came from a pretty fundamentalist background. His father was very strict Calvinist Christian, and you can see kind of his spiritual beliefs changing throughout these letters. And he's an interesting figure because he kind of maintains very much like Christian language when he's speaking about God or his maker, but some of his thinking, at least towards the middle and end of his life, definitely breaks with some more fundamental readings of Christianity. And I would love to go through some of those ideas with you, because, you know, as a Christian yourself, like, you've probably thought about a lot of this stuff a lot and seen these disagreements within the church and whatnot. As I understand it, the Bible teaches that the world and the animals and plants were made for man. And Muir kind of breaks with this. He says, quote, "It never seems to occur to these far-seeing teachers that nature's objects in making animals and plants might possibly be, first of all, the happiness of each one of them, not the creation of all for the happiness of one. Why should man value himself as more than a small part of one great unit of creation?" So I thought that was an interesting kind of break from maybe his more Christian roots. I don't know. Any thoughts on that passage? Or
that kind of thing? Sometimes I'll get a little nervous about something like that and think, oh, well, you know, is it that sort of smack of sort of universalism and you know, pantheism and things like that? And I don't know. And then on the other hand, sometimes I think about like Francis of Assisi, you know, who used to go out in nature and preach sermons to the birds, you know, and say your birds are lucky because, you know, God takes care of you and feeds you, and obviously he's kind of saying this so the people nearby would hear what he's saying. But he used to talk about like Brother Moon and, sister this and brother that, and he had a more openness, I think, to nature. I mean, I don't have the strong sense of like everything was made for me and I'm the chief of God's creations and it's all, because then I think how do I appreciate just the beauty of something in and of itself? Like I'm very big on the little things of the hike. I love the big mountain views and just the majesty of it all and the power of storms and all of that thing. But I also love like just watching a spider weave a web and, seeing, like I said, a little lizard on the ground or grasshopper or something like that, or watching leaves rustle, or even like the embers in a fire. When the fire dies down at the end of the night in a campfire. And there's like a beauty that's kind of seems isolated from who I am, that doesn't seem to be serving me in the sense. It's I don't know. It's just kind of like I think of God sort of laughing creation into existence sometimes, just like sheer joy. Just
it's interesting you use that metaphor. He uses a similar metaphor at one point. He kind of talks about these different aspects of nature as being God's laughs, as God's hands, as God's music, a lot of this kind of imagery. And also on that point of, you were saying like feeling the same kind of appreciation for something like a giant mountain landscape or just like a small leaf in front of you. Muir has an interesting idea about seeing all of nature on more or less the same plane and kind of not existing on these like higher and lower forms. He says, quote, "What is higher? What is lower in nature? We speak of higher forms, higher types in the field of scientific inquiry. Now all of the individual things or beings into which the world is wrought are sparks of the divine soul, variously clothed upon the flesh, leaves, or the harder tissue called rock, water. All of these varied forms, high and low, are simply portions of God." Interestingly enough, this made me think of Chief Seattle. He says in his kind of famous speech, he said, quote, "This we know, the earth does not belong to man, man belongs to the earth." And a lot of these ideas to me struck me to be both indicative of views of like indigenous people of America, which is kind of sad. I actually learned while researching this that he had some prejudiced views towards Native Americans and has kind of come under fire that recently, which is a shame and kind of ironic because I think his view on nature maps onto a lot of the views that, like this passage I just read from Chief Seattle. And some of the stuff I read from like the Tao Te Ching with like Lao Tzu and like Taoism is also very much in this vein.
And I think it's we can get so afraid of things like that as Christians that that we don't even want to look at it and explore it. One of my favorite mystics was Thomas Merton, and he spent a lot of times with different mystics from different religions, and a lot of people like that would bother them to say that he would look into it and explore it. And I don't like I said, there's probably sort of a built-in fear just because of the way we're raised, in our faith to think that anything that seems foreign might be might insult God, and I don't know. I guess I'd like to think that we can at least be open to hearing it and understanding it, and a lot of things they make sense. I mean, I think you can go like to the Bible and find a lot of this in there. You can find a lot of ideas in there, and I've always kind of believed that the biggest mountain and the smallest leaf are in God's mind, like that there isn't there's not some difference, like that, because everything's composed of molecules and atoms, and and it all has a purpose. It's like everything has a purpose. Everything was created, and it's all woven together. And it's like, I think I kind of look at it more as almost like a responsibility to appreciate its beauty more than like this beauty is serving us. Maybe it's more of a, we should be called to appreciate what God has given us in this life, and especially the beauty of nature. So.
Yeah. Well, and a few more quotes that kind of bring this idea home from Muir. He says, quote, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe." And then he says, "Rocks and water are words of God, and so are men. We all flow from one fountain soul. All are expressions of one love." And it also made me think. I recently watched this lecture from Alan Watts, and he was speaking about Taoism and Chinese philosophy. And Watts shows this portrait by this Chinese painter named Mai Wan. And what's interesting about this picture is it's called Poet Drinking by Moonlight, but it looks just like a landscape of a mountain. And you have to look really hard to see the poet drinking by the river in this landscape. And he says, quote, "You'd think it was just a landscape painting, but that tiny man lost in the landscape is representative and symbolic of the whole attitude of the Chinese mind and the Chinese philosophy, to the harmony of man and nature, man not dominating nature but fitting into it and feeling perfectly at home."
Well, you sort of think of like Van Gogh, and how his paintings kind of sort of almost merge sort of reality with what's beyond, when you think about that. And it's just, I don't know, I think it does come down to perspective, to how we look at things. And that's why I think certain people are more comfortable in the wilderness than other people, because they just, I don't know, I think the veil is torn back, and they're just able to appreciate the beauty of life and God and what goodness is and what surrender is and all of those things, just because there's sort of a oneness that we experience when we're out here.
Yeah, and Muir talks a lot about how he spent his life seeking God both in church and kind of scripture and in nature. And he says, quote, "I will confess that I take more intense delight from the reading the power and goodness of God from the things which are made than from the Bible. The two books, however, harmonize beautifully and contain enough of divine truth for the study of all eternity." And just one more on this point. He says, "It is by the grandest of all the special temples of nature I was ever permitted to enter." And I thought it was interesting that he uses the word temple to describe being out in nature. And I think maybe at another point he says something about a cathedral. And two thoughts on that. One, there's an effect called the Cathedral Effect, where being in a room with a higher ceiling causes different parts of the brain to communicate. So like when we are in a room with a very low ceiling, we tend to have thoughts that are very narrow and sharp and kind of analytical, whereas we do more kind of expansive thinking, and there's more areas of the brain that are making like these connections when we're in a room with a higher ceiling. It's called the Cathedral Effect. And I would assume that also applies to when we're in the mountains, like looking over like this beautiful horizon we're looking at. It's extremely expansive. And I would, like, if we were to speak to a neuroscience, I would imagine that they would probably say that we're able to do these a lot more expansive thinking. And that is, I think, one of the reasons that cathedrals and a lot of churches are built with the high ceilings, is it brings about in us that sense of awe and wonder and that very like expansive feeling. I don't know, any thoughts on that idea?
That's right. I didn't really know about that.
Yeah, I recently learned about it.
I guess to sort of understand it, like it makes total sense. I understand it intuitively because being out here, it's sort of like I have a sense of my smallness and my largeness at the same time. Sort of like I have a sense of how small I am in the vastness of creation, but I also I have a sense of just being loved and cherished by a good God who made all of this. So I in that sense, I guess I feel largeness, but it's probably more just it's a sense of awe or whatever. But I think, I don't know. Like I said, I think yes, maybe people have been spent too many days indoors, and their focus is too narrow. I don't know. But I love being out here. It's like I can't get enough of looking at this. The only thing that would make this better is if it were maybe 3 or 4 weeks later when it's just a blaze of color.
The fall change. Yeah, that's gonna be great.
But even this is just still just so beautiful and peaceful, and it makes problems
We're making
smaller.
our listeners jealous right now.
Oh,
I'm
I'm sure.
We're looking
I'm
at
sure.
the mountains right now in Connecticut. Yeah.
One thing I was thinking about is I think I have a better appreciation for kind of the oneness we can feel with nature because my theology is very incarnational. As a Christian, I understand. I just am in awe of the whole idea of God becoming man. And so I think a lot of Christian churches don't focus enough on that. They kind of focus on it's the word and coming to faith and the things you need to do to believe. And I'm not minimizing any of that. What I'm saying is we don't think about this if the God of the universe becoming a human being and, spitting into mud and making a new pair of eyes for a man born blind. That's interesting. As one person said, squeezing himself into bread, in communion and things like that. Using ordinary, everyday objects of nature to express himself to the world. Just the fact, like I said, of becoming a human being. We've just grown so accustomed to that. We don't, we see the little baby at Christmas, little nativity displays, and we don't think of how incredibly awesome that should make us feel if we believe that, if we understand it. So I think because my theology is very incarnational, everything's very sensual, in the sense of what I can smell and taste and see and hear, and so everything has a deeper meaning. One thing I've written about is I always talk about campsite meals being sacramental in nature.
Yep.
The same, if I made this meal at home, I might think this is a pretty bland meal. This isn't that special. Yeah. But in front of the campfire after a really hard day of, kind of soul-searching physical exertion to get to this goal, all of a sudden this meal takes on a higher significance. Sure. There's sort of incarnational value, spirit, the spirit, in that meal. And it becomes, like I said, becomes sort of sacramental. Conversations take on a deeper meaning, just the sort of fellowship that's shared. Just looking at things like looking at a fire and things that we take for granted that we don't have because we're out in the middle of the woods. All of a sudden it has a deeper meaning. And like I said, I just see it as an incarnational God in flesh kind of meaning that I can see much more clearly out here.
You kind of hinted at the feeling of gratitude is kind of goes along with that. And Muir talks a lot about, he ends a lot of these letters kind of giving thanks to God and just saying how grateful he is to be witnessing some of this incredible stuff. And that kind of resonated with me. He says, quote, "I am very, very blessed. I am rich, rich beyond measure." And then he says, "Rejoicing in his glory, I gladly, gratefully, hopefully pray I must see the view from the High Sierra again." That was one of the cool things I thought we did before we started when reading lunch. You said the little prayer and kind of, you were thanking God for this ability or opportunity that we have to have a conversation and have some food and go on a hike.
Yeah, but they're quote unquote tiny things, but they're not. They're really large, incredible, sort of universe-changing experiences. We don't think of them that way, but they really are. They really, like, I always thought there's, Christ said to people, like, greater works you will do. And everybody thinks that means, like, that they had to be like these big earth-shattering miracles. And I'm thinking sometimes, well, maybe the greater work is to change somebody's perspective on something, to get them from hating to loving, to get them to appreciate the little simple things and what that means, and to be able to, like Paul used to say, I've learned to be content, in plenty and in want. Like, it's the same. So
Yeah.
he's and I that's why I like hiking, because
Most like Muir says, he was content with just his tea and his flour.
Yeah.
He was like, that's all I need.
And I think it's just comes from that inner sense of appreciating everything from the, like I said, the big things, quote unquote big things, to the little big things. And I just love getting caught up in all of that, and it's just, like I said, it makes me sad when I go home, and I try to hold on to it. It's almost like waking from a dream. When you start, you kind of, oh, what was a dream? Oh, it was such a great dream, and then you're forgetting about it. And sometimes that's kind of how it feels coming back to the quote-unquote real world.
Yeah.
You kind of start to forget the lessons that you learned. And so I go as often as I can, because I want those lessons to really become so much a part of me that they don't get lost in the clutter and clamor of civilization. So.
Well, and that's a great point. He talks a lot about what you just said, kind of these, like, the way I termed it was kind of these, like, healing properties of nature on either the physical health or the spiritual health. He says, quote, "Climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Nature's peace will flow into you as sunshine flows into trees. The winds will blow their own freshness into you, and the storms their energy, while cares will drop off like autumn leaves." And then this last quote, this was actually one of the quotes that I read that made me want to read more Muir. I think it was in the documentary Mile and a Half, which is about these folks that hike the John Muir Trail. Quote, "Thousands of tired, nerve-shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out that going to the mountains is going home, that wildness is a necessity, and that mountain parks and reservations are useful not only as fountains of timber and irrigating rivers, but as fountains for life." The same way we kind of think about going on a diet or like a juice cleanse, Muir kind of thought of, like, he was living in Oakland for like 10 months and was like, I need to get the hell out of here and get back in the mountains. And he frames it very much as like going on a diet or like going on a cleanse. And I know for me, I just got off the Appalachian Trail. I was just out for 8 days, did like 100 miles. And it was a lot less of this kind of crazy immersive experience that it was last year, but it felt very much just kind of like a bath, maybe like a spiritual bath, or, I just felt I came back recharged, refreshed, ready to get started on my projects again. And, I've been working in Times Square. I was just feeling like very kind of like on edge and like just needed to get out of the city. And you're in a different position. You're like a 5-minute drive from these gorgeous mountains. I kind of need to binge my nature when I can get it. But you seem to have a more consistent, healthy diet, it seems like.
Yeah, I try to get out. But I will say I do kind of crave more of those longer experiences. Getting out for a day is good, but I do kind of like the couple of days. And I think we were talking earlier before we started the podcast. I was talking about I had a daughter getting married and a daughter going to school and a son buying a house and all this kind of taking place over the summer, and the stress of all of that. I didn't get out as much. I bike a lot. I didn't even get out on my bike to go riding because I was it's just.
And did you notice it, like, on your?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I was totally just exhausted, struggling to keep weight off, just all these kinds of things. Like I said, just less able to be disciplined in my life. disciplined about eating or praying, or just finding myself treating people with less gentleness and grace, and all of that, being more tense, all of these things happening, and just little problems becoming mountains of problems.
Yeah.
And that's why we do need to come out here, because then we can hold them up to these big mountains, and even to, like I said, the little things, the little rocks.
Well, and I think Muir would say that kind of, getting more and more tense, or this kind of like civilized life, that can kill us. And he says, quote, "Fear not thy mountain passes. They will kill care, save you from deadly apathy, set you free, and call forth every faculty into vigorous and enthusiastic action. Even the sick should try these so-called dangerous passes, because for every unfortunate they kill, they cure 1,000.
That's interesting. And I just reread that last night.
It's an interesting framing, right?
Yes. Oh, yeah. And but it's very true. It's very true that we need to, even if it's, I don't know, even if it's not exactly, a hiking experience or something, but just getting away just to like experience sort of the largeness of and beauty of nature, to help us to put the smallness of the pettinesses in our lives in perspective.
That's causing us so much stress and worry.
Because I will go home feeling like, why was I worried about such and such a thing?
Yeah.
It's just
and a lot of people forget that stress and worry can actually kill you. Maybe not in the immediate time that it would take to fall off of a mountain. And he is saying, like, you can die up here.
Yeah.
And I was actually talking to this guy on the AT, and he was telling me he's summited Mount Whitney out in Yosemite 3 times. And he said each day that I had summited Whitney, somebody died. Somebody, first time had a heart attack, second 2 times fell off. So by that framing, it seems like, well, why the hell would you ever do that? It's not safe, right? There is obviously risk in coming up, doing some kind of mountaineering, backpacking, whatever. But I think what he's pointing to in this passage is there's also risk in staying home, staying in your comfort, probably eating unhealthy food. Like we said, worrying about trivial things. Like, that can kill you too.
Oh, yeah. And not only like physically kill you, but just sort of overall just kill your spirit and just kind of make you less of who you were meant to be, know? And I just, like, I keep thinking of the movie Cinderella Man, and how the wife, I don't know if it was a Russell Crowe movie, and he was a boxer. He was James Braddock, and he was he's going through the Great Depression, and he ended up getting the opportunity to fight again, and he was going to fight this Max Baer who had basically killed several men in the boxing ring, and his wife was saying, no, don't go out there, and you can't do that, and I think Braddock's thinking was, I can die working on the docks, being in a skyscraper, I could fall off a skyscraper, working at this job or whatever. He's like, I want to go into the ring and do what I was meant to do. And I think
which goes back to the passage we talked about at the beginning, where he had the near-death experience working in the wagon factory that blinded him. Just like, you can die working in a factory too.
Yeah. And it's just, I don't know. I just, when I get my family's worry and what I have to work through is the ego part of it, where I say, whoa, they just, maybe if I were younger and thinner and stronger or this or that, maybe they wouldn't say that. They probably still would say it. They'd probably still worry. It doesn't matter. It matters how they feel. I care about how they feel about me and that they want me safe and all of that. But it's the idea that, this is important.
Yeah.
I need this. I need to go and do this.
That's great. And in Muir, his kind of mission in life, he said, quote, "I care to live only to entice people to look at nature's loveliness." And then he says, "Heaven knows that John the Baptist was not more eager to get us all fellow sinners into the Jordan than I am to baptize all of mine into the beauty of God's mountains." Yeah.
And so, sorry, I got distracted, but there's this hawk that's just floating on the wind.
Yeah.
for like 15 seconds just there, and it was just so beautiful. And kind of going to that point, like how, like, nobody, like, we didn't miss that. We got to see that because we're out here.
Yeah.
And
well, hopefully this podcast will encourage some people to take a hike.
I hope so. I hope so. I've been doing a lot of writing with regard to this, and there's a part of me that kind of said, well, I don't know if anything I'm writing is ever going to be published or any of that, but it's that sense of I want to share this with other people. I want them to understand, like, what it can be like, what it's like to be in nature, and just how, in a way, it's just like a little microcosm, a little metaphor, whatever word you want to use, for like our spiritual journey that we're on, and how important that is to and not as not to look at it's a goal. We're on life to reach a goal. And no, the journey itself, in a sense, is like a goal. The journey itself is the beautiful thing. And even the bad, quote unquote, bad parts, the struggles, and that's all part of this, moment by moment journey. We get to the end of our lives and we suddenly realize, wow, that went by fast, and I should have appreciated it more while I was doing it. And so I'm trying to learn to appreciate the little moments, and being out here teaches me that. Teaches me that when I go back home to, appreciate home from my home in the woods, I guess, to appreciate every little moment and what it means, even when there's struggles, because it's, in the grand scheme of things, it's very small, and that these little things, they're going to pass. We're a vapor. We're here for a while and gone. Nature remains. God remains. And yeah, so I hope this helps people to get out there.
Well, Mark, this was so great, and I appreciate you talking to me and coming out here.
Oh, it was fun. It was fun. I enjoyed the hike and the meal and just everything. So thank you.
Thanks for listening to Unpacking Ideas. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, or scroll down and give us a rating or write us a review. All that stuff helps a lot, so thanks for doing that in advance. If you would like to get in touch with me or to hear about what's coming up next on the podcast, visit unpackingideas.com/podcast. And there I post links to all of the articles, essays, books that we'll be discussing on future podcast episodes. And finally, if you would like to hear more from my guest Mark and to check out some of his work, visit his website, wordsinvisions.com. That's words, the letter N, visions.com. Mark is an author, a ministry consultant, and a man of words whose mission is to inspire and heal people through his writing. So definitely check out his website. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next episode.